Did you know that colonial punishments in some African territories were reportedly 3 times harsher than in Europe for the same crimes? These colonial crimes against African people and nations went largely unpunished. Today, we delve into the chilling history of how colonial powers used criminal law as a tool of oppression in Africa. We will expose the systems of injustice that reshaped the continent and whose echoes still reverberate today. Colonial rule was not merely political domination, it was a system built on criminalizing resistance. European powers used the law to suppress dissent, control labor, and dismantle anti-colonial movements. What appears as a simple act of protest could be labeled rebellion, attracting the most severe penalties. Colonial authorities reserved the harshest punishments for acts they perceived as threats to their rule, including anything from rebellion to simple administrative violations. Even pre-existing systems of justice in African societies were undermined. Native and customary laws were subordinated to colonial criminal codes, ensuring that Europeans held ultimate control. As colonial rule tightened its grip, prison systems expanded dramatically across Africa. Sierra Leone provides an early chilling example, with prison-like institutions appearing as early as 1812. In settler colonies, prisons served as tools of labor discipline and, more broadly, population control. The labor of prisoners became integral to colonial economies, fueling public works and private ventures. Colonial punishment in Africa was notoriously harsher than in the colonizing countries themselves. Take Tanganyika in the 1950s, where punishments were reportedly 3 times as harsh. Whipping, imprisonment, forced labor, and capital punishment were common. In extreme cases, entire villages faced collective punishment and destruction. The Congo Free State, under the brutal reign of King Leopold II of Belgium, represents one of the most extreme examples of a criminal regime in colonial Africa. From 1885 to 1908, the Congo was subjected to unimaginable horrors. Hostage-taking, mutilation, forced rubber collection, and lethal violence by the force public were rampant. These atrocities are among the most well-documented crimes of the colonial era. Colonial violence also manifested in massacres and brutal counterinsurgency campaigns. France's conquest of Algeria, starting in 1830, was marked by mass killings, torture, internment, and the destruction of villages. During the Algerian War of Independence, French forces systematically used torture. The 1947 Malagasy uprising against French rule was met with ferocious suppression, with death toll estimates ranging from 40,000 to 100,000. In Cameroon, France violently suppressed the Union of the Peoples of Cameroon in the 1950s and 1960s, raising entire villages in counterinsurgency operations. In Kenya, during the Mau Mau uprising, the British colonial government employed detention camps, forced confessions, corporal punishment, and mass detention. The Ola Camp massacre, on March 3, 1959, saw 11 detainees die after savage beatings by guards. However, it's crucial to remember that pre-colonial Africa was not a lawless land. Many societies had sophisticated criminal justice systems. The Songhai Empire, for example, had structured justice, with separate systems for royal justice and Islamic judicial authority. Similar systems existed in other West African states, featuring local adjudication and regional officials akin to police. Colonial prisons were not just places of confinement, they were tools for extracting labor. They were used to recruit forced labor, discipline workers, and reform prisoners through hard labor. Incarceration was directly linked to colonial economic exploitation. Whipping was one of the most common forms of punishment across colonial Africa, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was often carried out in public to humiliate and instill terror. Although exposure of its abuses led to some limitations, it remained a frequent practice for decades. Before formal prison systems, colonial powers used forts, barracoons, and coastal holding compounds as makeshift prisons. These held captives awaiting shipment in the slave trade and those caught in other coercive colonial systems. Colonial states also used criminal law to manage labor migration. In settler societies, pass laws, labor contracts, movement restrictions, and vagrancy laws criminalized Africans who were not in approved labor arrangements. Colonial administrations frequently selected and redefined customary law to suit their goals. Chiefs were used as intermediaries in criminal enforcement, making customary law a colonial construct rather than a neutral tradition. The atrocities in the Congo were not random acts of violence. They were embedded in a system of quotas and coercion tied to robber extraction, hostage-taking, punitive expeditions, and forced labor enforcement. Colonial rule reshaped African states by introducing centralized policing, prison systems, penal codes, and surveillance. These institutions outlasted the empire and became part of post-colonial governance. Colonial law normalized state violence. Extreme violence, such as corporal punishment, detention without due process, and collective punishment, was often treated as lawful administration, creating a legacy of repression. Colonial criminal law helped create modern inequalities by differentiating between Europeans, settlers, Africans, laborers, and unruly communities. This legal hierarchy shaped land ownership, labor conditions, political rights, and access to justice. Anti-colonial leaders and resistance movements were often prosecuted as criminals rather than recognized as political actors. Figures like Kenyan Mau Mau fighters, Algerian nationalists, and anti-apartheid activists were all criminalized. Memories of massacres, detention camps, forced labor, amputations, village destruction, and torture remain central to political identity and historical grievance in many African states. Today, modern police and prison systems in many African nations descend from colonial models, inheriting centralized police structures, emergency powers, prison architectures, and legal codes designed for control. African governments and institutions are increasingly demanding acknowledgement, apology, restitution, and reparations for colonial crimes. The African Union has recently advocated for stronger recognition of colonialism and slavery as crimes against African peoples. Contemporary legal disputes often echo colonial abuses, focusing on land dispossession, torture, detention, forced labor, mass killings, and stolen cultural property. Memory politics are central, with ongoing debates over statues, monuments, museum holdings, archival access, and official apologies. Legal categories inherited from colonial rule continue to influence governance, affecting customary law, chieftaincy disputes, criminal justice access, and state legitimacy. However, some aspects of this history remain controversial or suppressed. Death toll estimates for events like the Congo Free State atrocities and the Malagasy uprising are heavily contested. Colonial archives are often incomplete and biased, undercounting African deaths, framing violence as pacification, omitting African testimony, and sanitizing torture and coercion. In former colonial powers, school curricula and public memory often understate the extent of colonial violence. The role of African collaborators is also a politically sensitive topic, often overlooked, but integral to understanding the full picture. It's important, as we reflect on this history, to remember that justice delayed is justice denied. The ghosts of colonial crimes continue to haunt Africa, demanding acknowledgement, understanding, and ultimately, redress. The unpunished crimes of colonialism are a stark reminder of the enduring legacies of injustice that continue to shape our world. Now, let us dig deeper together. What are your thoughts on the long-term effects of colonial laws? Share your opinions in the comments.